So, have you ever really stopped to think about how an idea, a belief, or a really powerful message actually makes the leap from one culture to a totally different one? I mean, it's not as simple as just translating words, right? It's a super fascinating process full of all kinds of challenges and tricky dynamics. In this explainer, we're going to dig into a specific framework that's designed to do exactly that. So, let's jump right in. Right. So, this is the big question, isn't it? The one at the very heart of what we're talking about today. It's so much more than just language. We're talking about navigating completely different ways of seeing the world, different customs, different social structures, the whole thing. And the source material we're looking at gives us a model, a way to think about how this actually happens.
Okay, so here's our game plan for today. We'll start by defining what it even means to cross that cultural divide. Then we'll check out a simple A to B model that kind of maps out the journey. After that, we'll get into the intended outcome. What's the goal here? We'll tackle 7 of the biggest real-world barriers, and then finally, we'll look at a 5-step strategy for actually building that bridge.
All right, first up, crossing the divide. To really get started, we've got to define what we mean by crossing the divide. And the source material frames this whole thing using the idea of transcultural missions. So what does that actually mean? Well, according to our source, this is all about intentionally carrying a message across some pretty significant cultural boundaries. And look, we're not just talking about going to the next town over. We're talking about overcoming these really deep-seated linguistic, social, and even ethnic barriers to communicate with a whole new group of people. It's a huge undertaking. And this slide really helps drive home a key difference. You know, a traditional mission often works within a pretty familiar cultural setting. You've got the same language, similar social rules. It's easier. But a transcultural mission, that's a huge leap into a radically different context. It demands this really profound level of adaptation and what the source calls contextualization. Basically, figuring out how to make the message actually make sense to people. Okay, so to help us visualize this big leap, the source gives us a simple but really powerful framework. Let's call it the A to B model. It breaks this whole complicated process down into its most basic parts. So the model starts with what it calls culture A. Think of this as the starting point. It's the home culture of the messenger, the place where the message itself was formed. You could almost think of it as the source code for the idea that's about to be sent out. And that messenger, coming from culture A, is trying to carry their message to culture B. This is the destination, the host culture. And it has its own totally unique language, its own history, its own values, its own social structures, all completely distinct from culture A. Now, this is where things get really, really interesting. If a message successfully makes it from A to B, what's the actual goal? Like, what's the desired outcome supposed to be inside culture B? The answer? Well, it might surprise you. The source actually asks this exact question. What's supposed to happen culturally when someone in culture B accepts this new message? Do they have to, abandon their own culture and just adopt all the ways of culture A? The framework is super clear on this. And the answer is a big, fat no. This is absolutely crucial. The objective is not cultural replacement. It's not about turning people from culture B into carbon copies of people from culture A. The goal is to create something new within culture B, what the source calls a counterculture. And here's the strategic genius behind that idea. The most effective, the most authentic, and the most powerful messenger to the rest of culture B is someone from this new counterculture. And why is that? Well, because they're insiders. They speak the language, they get all the nuances, and they can authentically bridge that gap between the new message and their own established culture in a way that an outsider from culture A just never could. Okay, so that A to B model sounds pretty clean and simple on paper, right? But theory is one thing, and reality, well, that's a whole other story. The source is very clear that in the real world, there's some major obstacles that stand in the way. In fact, it points out 7 key barriers that can complicate or even totally derail this whole process of transcultural communication. Let's break them down. So, the first bunch of barriers are all about communication and social stuff. First up, you've got the obvious one, linguistic differences. And that's not just about learning a new language, it's also about the lack of translated materials. Then there's culture shock, that really deep feeling of disorientation you get trying to adapt to new customs and values. Third, you're going to run into deeply rooted local beliefs. And finally, there's always the risk of just outright rejection, especially if the new message is seen as some kind of cultural threat. And beyond that, there are also structural and practical barriers. I'm talking about big lifestyle differences that can cause friction, especially around things like family roles or social systems like castes. Then there's the really practical challenge of sustainability, securing long-term funding. And finally, we're back to that tricky idea of contextualization, the huge difficulty of making a message feel relevant without accidentally twisting its core meaning.
So, with all those barriers, how in the world do you actually build a bridge between culture A and culture B? The good news is, the source doesn't just list a bunch of problems, it lays out a clear, actionable strategy for moving forward. The source gives us this clear 5-step approach. Number 1, learn. And this means really studying the local language and culture with a sense of humility. Number 2, relate. Focus on building genuine, real relationships before you even think about sharing the message. 3, collaborate. This is huge. Work alongside local leaders to help foster a natural acceptance. 4, contextualize. Be thoughtful and develop strategies that are actually relevant to that specific culture. And finally, number 5, persevere. You've got to maintain your focus and just navigate all the inevitable challenges with some serious resilience. At the end of the day, what this whole framework describes is a process that goes way beyond any single application. I mean, think about it. Whether you're in business, diplomacy, or just trying to forge a human connection, the principles are exactly the same. Understanding how to cross these cultural divides is really about expanding our own horizons. It's about connecting what we know with what others know. And ultimately, it's about creating the possibility for real, genuine transformation.